A large number of people from all sorts of theological backgrounds seem to think that the Gospel of John is there to teach that Jesus is God. Evangelicals search it for proof texts, and critics assert that John's Gospel has a high Christology and must therefore be late. But the reality is that it isn't like that. John's Gospel doesn't teach that Jesus is God. Instead, it tells us that Jesus is the Son of God, sent to reveal his Father and show us what God is like. So we're going to look at that very briefly, but this is the first video in a series on John's Gospel. Look out for the others. If you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notify button, then those videos will come up when we release them. Let's start off by thinking about the purpose of John's Gospel. John's Gospel is written us for a particular reason, and that reason tells us what the Gospel is going to be about. Here it is, the Gospel tells us why it's written, and the point is there at the end of John chapter 20, and it's there so that we can understand, we can believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It doesn't use the idea that Jesus is God, it's the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. And it's also there to show us that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the person promised in the Old Testament as the ruler appointed by God, anointed by God to rule the world. So there's a difference in the purpose of John's Gospel and in the idea that people have of what John's Gospel is going to be like. So, no suggestion that Jesus is God in the purpose of John's Gospel. Let's do a quick survey of what is in John's Gospel. Starts off with a chart. It starts off there at the prologue. The number of verses is going along there, and that's the set of chapters. So right at the beginning of John chapter 1, we've got this prologue, the description of the word, followed by the baptism of Jesus. There's then a series of signs and discourses where Jesus performs miracles and talks to other people, his disciples, opponents sometimes, general public, and talks about himself, who he is and what he's doing. Then moves on to the last week. Actually, most of that is just the last day, and chapter 12 is most last week, chapter 13 is the Last Supper, and then from 14 to 16 a discourse with the disciples and a prayer in chapter 17. We then have the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and finally we've got an epilogue where Jesus talks to Peter and to John and explains something about what's happening right at the end of the lives of Peter and John. In that book, we have a few passages which are picked out, particularly by Trinitarians, and used to try to explain that Jesus is God. But there are only a few of them, and in fact, you can understand those in different ways. They don't have to be understood the way the Trinitarians understand them. What there is throughout the rest of it is a huge number of passages which tell us that Jesus is not God. And I want to look at those as well as the ones which are used by Trinitarians. Look at the whole lot, put it together and see what the whole gospel says. So a few examples. So the first one is that throughout John's Gospel, there is a big distinction between Jesus and God. So the Gospel always makes this distinction. It doesn't miss it out. It never confuses Jesus and God. Here's an example. John chapter 14, Jesus says, "Believe in God, believe also in me." Now, the important thing here is that there are two references in that verse. One of them is God, the other one is Jesus, but Jesus is here as a different referent. Believe in God, believe also in me, says Jesus. Two separate beings, two separate reference. Jesus is not described as God. In fact, Jesus is described himself as being separate from God there. Now, that's something that appears a lot. It comes up over and over again in the Gospel of John. A few more passages just there came up. You can see there that Jesus isn't God. Another one, the Gospel of John shows us over again that Jesus is not equal to God. He doesn't make himself equal to God. There's one passage, again, John chapter 14. Jesus talks to his disciples and he says, I'm going to the Father. He says, you should be happy about that because the Father is greater than Jesus is. Jesus is telling us that God is greater than he is, that the Father is greater than Jesus. Jesus has someone greater than him. There's another one. This is after the resurrection to Mary Magdalene. Jesus says to Mary, don't hang on to me, don't touch me. He says, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Jesus is telling Mary Magdalene that he has a God. Well, God doesn't have a God. God is the greatest being. You can't have anything greater than God, and your God is greater than you are. What Jesus is saying is he's not the supreme being. This is telling everyone that Jesus is not God, and these are the words of Jesus saying it. There's another one. The idea that God the Father is the only God. So it's a fairly innocuous verse here in John 5, verse 44, but God identifies himself, or at least Jesus identifies God as the only God. And if you read the context of that verse, and I advise you to go and do that, you'll see that he's talking about his Father throughout. He's saying his Father is the only God. That word only, monos, is a very emphatic word, the one God. It's the only God. It's not talking about a God in many parts or anything like that. It's showing that God, the Father, is the one God. It's rather interesting because, of course, Jesus is also described as the only Son. Many translations, different word in Greek, the word monogenes. It's a word that's only used of a child. It's used of a son, an only child. Jesus is the only Son of God. Quite often it's translated as only begotten because it emphasizes this particular point that the word means that Jesus is the only person who comes from the Father. Is the only Son that comes directly from the Father. Again, it's a new picture. It's not a picture that's consistent with the idea that Jesus is God. And another one that comes up a lot, the idea that Jesus was sent by God. Here we have a passage. Jesus says he came from God. Two reference. One is Jesus. The other is God. Jesus came from God. And he says God sent Jesus. So again, it's talking about not the Father sends Jesus, but God sent Jesus. Now, Jesus points out something about being sent. Here's a passage that talks about it, John chapter 13. The servant is not greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. That word there, servant, that's a lot stronger than just a servant. He's talking about a slave. Jesus is likening himself to the slave sent by God. Jesus is sent the same way that the slave is sent. And he's emphasizing the fact that God is greater than Jesus at this point. And again, it's something that crops up many, many times in the Gospel of John. I found 42 verses which say that God sent Jesus. Quite a lot. Something that you can't ignore. Now, those are just a few of the passages from John's Gospel which show that Jesus is not God. Do they make a clear case Let us know in the comments down below this video. What's interesting, though, is not just what's in John's Gospel, but what's not in John's Gospel. What's not in John's Gospel is a clear description of Jesus as God, or a clear discussion of the idea that Jesus might be God. Here's an example. John chapter 14, verse 8. What's going on here is between the Last Supper and the prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. And here Jesus is asked by his disciples to reveal God to them. Show us the Father, says Philip, one of the disciples. And Jesus is alone with the disciples, got plenty of time to talk to them about it. If this is the important point about Jesus, the idea that Jesus is God, then this is the time to explain it to the disciples. Jesus doesn't. He never does that. What Jesus does instead is to show that he reveals God. He shows how he reveals God. And that is an important point, because if Jesus was God, this is the time when he ought to be saying that he was God. There is, in fact, no passage anywhere in John's Gospel, in fact, anywhere in the Bible, which explains the doctrine of the Trinity in any, well, at all, let alone in any detailed manner. It just isn't there. The big point about Jesus is that Jesus reveals what God is like. That's John chapter 1, verse 18. There's a textual issue here, but I think this is probably the best representation of that verse. The point about it is that no one can see God. No one's seen God. You can't see God. But Jesus has made him known. Jesus tells us what God is like. We've got this picture of God at the top, mankind at the bottom, and Jesus gets the information from God and passes it on and shows human beings what God is like. Jesus speaks the words of God, he does the work of God, but he shows the character of God. He shows us what God is like. John chapter 14, where they've already asked about the relationship between Jesus and God, Jesus says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Now, if you don't think about it, you might consider that to be an example where Jesus is saying that he's God, but he isn't. He doesn't say God, he says the Father. And even in the doctrine of the Trinity, Jesus is not the Father. What Jesus is doing is showing you what the Father is like. So if you look at Jesus, then you know what God is like. You've seen the works of God, you've heard the words of God, and you've seen the character of God expressed in the Son of God. That's the point about Jesus. That's what John's Gospel is about. Another point, important one, several times in John's Gospel, Jesus is accused of making himself God or making himself equal to God. There's one from John chapter 10. The Jews, it means the authorities in Judea, not to be confused with the authorities in Galilee. So the authorities in Judea have accused Jesus of making himself God, of claiming to be God. What does Jesus do? Well, the next few verses, he refutes that. He picks passages out from the Old Testament, one particular from Psalm 82, where he's talking about the judges of Israel, people who had the law of God given to them and who then went and interpreted that for the people in Israel. And Jesus is saying, look, these people aren't God, but certain points apply to them. He himself claims to be the Son of God. That's not God. It's less than God, but it's the same sort of thing that the people were claiming there in the Old Testament. So Jesus has refuted the accusation. He's saying, no, you've got it wrong. I'm not making myself God. And by saying that, he is saying that he is not God. He's not going to lie about it. He's not going to say he's not God if he is. So by refuting their accusation, Jesus has shown that he is not God. Why God sent Jesus? Well, we've got that in this passage, famous passage, John chapter 3, verse 16. But notice the wording. God gave his son. To reference God and the Son of God. God sent his son into the world so that the world might be saved through him. Whenever you see that verse, you've got a verse which actually isn't compatible with the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity, you might have had the Father sent the Son, or you might have had God sent himself, but not God sent the Son. That's very much an anti-Trinitarian statement. It's one that you can't make into the doctrine of the Trinity. Finally, we've got the similar task that Jesus has to the task he sets the disciples. So it starts off, God has sent Jesus to show us what he's like. And now Jesus is sending disciples, he's sending us, his followers, to show what God is like, to proclaim the message both of God and of Jesus. It's the same message for both. That's the task of the disciple of Jesus. But Jesus is showing a likeness. He is to God the same way that we are to him. The Father sent Jesus. Jesus sends us. That's a biblical picture of the relationship between God, Jesus, and the disciples. Well, that's the first video in a series which examines John's Gospel and explains what it really teaches about Jesus. If you want, you can see videos on individual chapters out of John which bring out these points. So if you subscribe to this channel, hit the notify button, you'll see the others. They'll come up with it. Or you can look on the playlist and find those videos which will follow on from this one. So hope you enjoy them all. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, and don't forget to hit the notify button.